Charles quietly settled into his first-class seat, exuding an air of dignified calm that belied the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. Clad in a crisp white shirt tucked into dark gray slacks and a light tailored jacket, he carried only a modest garment bag, embossed boldly with the inscription, Police Chief, Chicago Metro. Yet despite his unassuming attire, Charles was never the sort of man who sought the spotlight. His honor and character shone through in every measured step, every soft-spoken word, and every deliberate breath he took in a world quick to judge by appearances. No one could have anticipated the pandemonium that would soon consume this flight. As the golden hues of the late afternoon sun streamed through the panoramic windows, casting elongated shadows across the cabin, a voice cut sharply through the comfortable silence. The flight attendant, Eliza, known for her pristine uniform and steadfast adherence to rules, paused abruptly on her rounds, standing before him with a rigid posture, her red lipstick accentuating the severity in her eyes. She demanded, "Are you sure you belong here?" Her tone, icy and dismissive, echoed not only in the cramped confines of the aircraft but also in the hearts of every passenger who witnessed the encounter. Little did she know that her seemingly trivial inquiry was the spark that would ignite an inferno of injustice and retribution. Charles's response was soft yet firm. "Yes, this is my seat, 1C," he stated, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made the room grow even more stifling. He extended his boarding pass, a simple document that affirmed his right to sit in first class. A ticket, paid in full, earned through decades of dedication and service. But Eliza's eyes, clouded with suspicion and tinged with an unspoken bitterness, scrutinized every line and number on that pass as if she were searching for a flaw in his identity. "Are you traveling on duty or perhaps accompanying someone?" she pressed, almost as though her question masked a much deeper prejudice. Charles's measured nod in response did nothing to settle her growing doubts. Instead, it fanned the flames of her resentment, an emotion born not merely of protocol but of a festering disdain for someone who, by his very presence, challenged the narrow confines of her rigid worldview. As Eliza moved away toward the galley, her every step carrying the weight of someone determined to assert authority, Charles sank deeper into his seat. The murmurs of fellow passengers, whispered remarks laced with pity and thinly veiled contempt, became a backdrop to his inner turmoil. He reached for his phone and sent a quick message to his wife Zareen, whose loving encouragement was a rare beacon of warmth in a world that had too often forgotten his worth. Her words on the screen: "Call me when you land. So proud of you. I love you," brought a fleeting smile to his face, even as the cold glances and hushed whispers in the cabin reminded him painfully of the prejudice he endured on a daily basis. Unbeknownst to Charles, this flight was destined to transcend a mere instance of racial discrimination. It would evolve into a grand stage for an epic showdown, a battle of wills between a man wronged and a woman blinded by her own insecurities and learned biases. While Charles's quiet resilience and dignified manner stirred nothing more than murmurs among the passengers, Eliza's inner thoughts churned with a mix of self-righteous conviction and simmering hostility. For her, first class was sacred territory, a realm reserved for those who met her arbitrary standards of decorum. Charles, with his simple yet dignified demeanor and an unassuming uniform bag, unsettled her deeply rooted belief that certain people simply did not belong among the elite. In the midst of an already charged atmosphere, another attendant named Mina, a gentle soul still new to the intricacies of airline hierarchies, watched the unfolding scene with a conflicted heart. Mina's quiet observations and the subtle nod she offered to Charles in passing hinted at an empathy that contrasted sharply with Eliza's overt cruelty. Yet even Mina could not entirely dispel the tension that now gripped the cabin. As Charles sat back and sipped a glass of water, an offering from Eliza that was served with all the cold politeness of a transaction rather than genuine concern, the air between them crackled with a silent promise of retribution. Charles's mind was a tempest of reflections on the numerous times he had faced similar indignities, In upscale restaurants, grand hotel lobbies, and the echoing corridors of board meetings, where subtle looks and hushed comments belied respect until one's true identity was revealed. But on an airborne vessel hurtling through the vast American skies, the isolation was suffocating, with no exit in sight and no protective barrier apart from the metal walls of the plane. Every scrutinizing gaze and whispered slander felt personal, invasive, a call to arms that had been building within him for far too long. Each moment of silence and each slight, when compounded together, became not merely an instance of discrimination but a declaration of war, a war fueled by decades of quiet suffering and ignominy. Charles's eyes drifted from the brilliant blue of the passing clouds outside to the more turbulent weather of his own memories. In the recesses of his heart lay scars born not just of professional challenges, but of the relentless prejudice that saw him defined solely by the color of his skin, a factor so superficial yet wielded so destructively by those like Eliza. From the far end of the cabin, whispers intensified. A young passenger named Bilal, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and indignation, leaned toward his sister Huda and murmured about how unjustly Charles had been treated. Their innocent voices carried the weight of a collective empathy, the shared recognition that behind every act of cruelty lay a man who had loved and served his community with unwavering dedication. And as the engine's roar signified the ascent of the airplane into the higher, less judgmental skies, the plot of this journey began to tilt inexorably toward an unforeseen climax. The stage was being set, silently yet powerfully, for a reversal of fortunes that would leave every witness in absolute astonishment. For while Eliza believed herself to be merely enforcing protocol, her actions had unleashed a force that would soon upend the conventional balance of power. Unknown to her, Charles had harbored a secret that went far beyond his professional accolades, a quiet resolve for eventual retribution that had been forged in the fires of a lifetime of discrimination. It was this resolve that, like a coiled spring ready to burst, would soon demand its own reckoning. In a moment of introspection, Charles recalled Zarine's constant reassurances and the pride she took in his achievements. Each memory served as a silent protest against the injustice he faced. As he checked his phone one final time, he received another message from her, a terse inquiry laced with concern. What exactly happened? Her words, though gentle, carried an undercurrent of determination, a prelude to the dramatic response that was already in motion. With each tap on the screen, each measured word replying to her inquiry, Charles's determination crystallized. The humiliation he faced would not be left unanswered. Meanwhile, back in the galley, Eliza found herself standing at a crossroads. Her colleagues, especially the ever-observant Mina, raised gentle questions about the integrity of her actions. Did you check the system properly? Could it be that your judgment was clouded today? Mina asked softly, her tone neither accusatory nor confrontational, but filled with the understated wisdom of someone who saw more than most. Eliza's response was curt and bitter, an indictment of her years of unquestioned service and a stubborn belief in her own superiority. The friction between them, a microcosm of the larger societal divides that had long haunted their interactions, hinted at the inevitable confrontation that loomed ahead. And so, as the airplane soared effortlessly at 35,000 feet above the continent, the seeds of a titanic clash had been sown. Charles, once a quiet observer of injustice, was now ignited with the promise of monumental retribution. A retribution that would be as grand and sweeping as the injustice he had endured. His soul, weathered by the years of relentless prejudice, was set on a collision course with fate itself, driven by a deep-seated need to overturn the wrongs that had long been tolerated in silence. This flight, once destined to be a routine journey, had metamorphosed into a battleground where every gesture and every glance carried the potential for transformation. As the cabin lights dimmed and the steady hum of the engines turned into a lullaby for some while a rallying cry for others, Charles's inner fire blazed brighter than ever. What had begun as an ordinary travel experience was now poised to become a legendary tale of defiance, retribution, and the pursuit of dignity. A tale that would ultimately challenge the forces of prejudice and command a response so striking that even the hardened hearts of those accustomed to cruelty would be forced to reconsider the true meaning of justice. By the time the wheels touched down on American soil, none of those on board would ever forget the flight that defied convention, tested the bounds of racial prejudice, and culminated in a promise of epic retaliation. And though the details of that promise were yet to be revealed, the unmistakable transformation in Charles's gaze spoke volumes. A silent oath that the injustices of the past would no longer be left unchallenged. The time for quiet acceptance had ended, and the stage was set for a reckoning so magnificent in its scope that even the skeptics would, at last, be left utterly in awe. Charles had long mastered the art of controlled composure, even when the winds of injustice howled around him. It was not raw anger that fueled his resolve now, but a quiet, unyielding determination. His wife, Zara Washington, was not one to let a slight go unnoticed. She had built her airline empire from scratch over the past 7 years, and now her name shone like a beacon in boardrooms and industry magazines alike. Yet, the audacity of the unfolding events on Flight 267 threatened to undermine everything she had fought for. Standing in her spacious, sun-drenched office with awards lining the shelf behind her, Zara's expression hardened as she read the latest message on her phone. Her eyes, usually warm and inviting, narrowed as she realized that a first-class passenger, her own husband, Charles, had been treated like a stranger by none other than Eliza, the flight attendant whose rigid adherence to outdated protocols now reeked of prejudice. Zara's mind raced, and without wasting a moment she strode purposefully toward her assistant Nomen, who immediately looked up, recognizing the gravity in her tone as she demanded to speak with operations. "Get me a direct line to the captain and connect our onboard supervisor to the control office immediately," she said, her voice steady but laced with the authority of someone who had rebuilt an industry empire with her own hands. Back on board, Eliza moved stiffly through the cabin, her eyes darting nervously between her duties and the lingering presence of Charles, whose dignified silence was now charged with an atmosphere of impending reckoning. Every step she took felt heavier than the last as the disapproving stares from the passengers intensified. There was no escaping the truth that had been laid bare by the exchange that earlier embarrassed Charles in front of everyone. The memory of that moment, when he calmly responded to her insensitive questioning of his boarding pass, now echoed in every whispered remark from a concerned passenger, including Tariq, a regular first-class flyer, who quietly confessed that he had witnessed the entire debacle and silently expressed his dismay. At the front of the plane, as the captain received a flashing alert on his cockpit screen, a coded message simply tagged as "Executive Override." Captain Nasser's face tightened with understanding. Only one person had the authority to issue such an order, and the message left no room for further doubt. He immediately established a live video call with Jamal, the head of flight services, who sat upright in his office chair with a seriousness that sent a chill down the spines of those watching. Jamal's measured voice on the screen cut through the tension as he explained that the executive office had received a complaint from a first-class passenger. The name on the call was now intimately tied to the case. He explained that this was not just any passenger but Charles Washington, the esteemed police chief of Chicago Metro, and, crucially, the husband of the airline's CEO, Zara Washington. With that pronouncement, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted dramatically as Captain Nasser ordered Eliza to immediately report to the cockpit. The announcement crackled over the intercom, and for a brief moment time itself seemed to slow as passengers exchanged looks of mixed shock and sympathy. Eliza, caught off guard and visibly trembling, paused and set aside her tray, her heart pounding in her ears. The clamor of the engine seemed to fade as she began her cautious trek toward the cockpit, fully aware that her every move was being scrutinized not just by the crew, but by every passenger whose eyes now brimmed with a mix of curiosity and quiet indignation. Meanwhile, Charles sat quietly, his face a mask of calm resignation as he resumed reading a magazine that now seemed insignificant in light of the events unfolding. Yet inside him, a storm was building. He had weathered a lifetime of subtle slights and overt discrimination with grace, but now the collective witness of those around him intensified the hurt he felt with every measured step that Eliza took toward him. Once in the cockpit, the tension reached a fevered pitch. Captain Nasir, maintaining an unwavering demeanor, turned his unflinching gaze toward Eliza as he relayed Jamal's message. Jamal's voice had been clear and unyielding. Eliza was to return to Charles and deliver a public apology in front of all passengers, followed by an escort back to his seat with the full range of first-class services restored to him. The words fell like gavel strikes in the silent cabin. Eliza's face paled as the full gravity of her mistake, compounded by the inherent bias that had led her to single out Charles, fully sunk in. With no room left for excuses, she could only manage a halting admission. "Mr. Washington, I apologize for the way I treated you earlier. I made an assumption based on limited information, and I realize now that I was wrong. I embarrassed you publicly, and I deeply regret that," she said, her voice barely rising above a whisper. Yet even as the apology left her lips, it seemed to fall into a void, barely registering amidst the heavy silence that had enveloped the cabin. Charles, maintaining his quiet dignity, responded in a measured tone that belied the complexity of his inner tumult. "I have faced worse indignities throughout my life, but this public humiliation is something I never expected. It is not enough to merely apologize, the offense needs to be acknowledged and remedied," he said softly, his words carrying the weight of a lifetime of perseverance against bias and disdain. The exchange was brief, yet each syllable struck a chord with the assembled passengers, many of whom had witnessed Charles's ordeal with a mix of sympathy and righteous indignation. A woman in seat D turned her head as if to gather every word, while a man sitting across the aisle lowered his newspaper, all silently urging for justice to be truly served. With the public apology delivered, Eliza hesitated momentarily before retreating toward the aft of the plane, her mind a storm of regret and anxiety. She did not return to the galley immediately. Instead, she sought refuge in the lavatory, locking the door behind her and leaning heavily against the mirror. Her trembling hands and downcast eyes betrayed the inner torment of someone who had just seen her professional authority unravel into a humiliating spectacle. Outside, in the main cabin, Charles resumed his silent vigil by the window, his eyes fixed on the endless expanse of cotton-like clouds drifting over the American landscape below. Though his face remained composed, his heart harbored a quiet storm of sorrow and a fierce resolve. Each furtive glance from his fellow passengers, each whispered word of support or silent scorn, further inflamed his sense of injustice. He had always known that in a world so quick to judge appearances and so slow to grant respect, the scars of prejudice ran deep. Yet on this flight, a turning point had been reached. For many, it was a moment of reckoning, a clear indictment of a system that judged on superficial markers rather than intrinsic worth. Charles's silence, his unyielding calm, stood as a testament to a lifetime of resilience. But within that silence lay a promise of future retribution that was as inevitable as it was monumental. In every whispered conversation in the aisle, in every compassionate glance exchanged among passengers, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of support for Charles. Meanwhile, Captain Nasir resumed his duties, his eyes reflecting both the responsibility of his role and the awareness of the storm that such incidents could foment when left unattended. As the flight continued its steady course, Zara Washington's intervention on the ground became a harbinger of change. Her decisive action, her insistence on accountability, resonated not only through the corporate structure of her airline, but also in the hearts of those who believed that dignity and respect were non-negotiable. The journey was no longer just a flight between two American cities. It had become a symbol of resistance against the subtle, yet pernicious, forces of prejudice. For Charles, every passing minute on that flight deepened his resolve. The humiliation he endured was a spark, igniting the flames of a determination that would one day transform into a formidable campaign for justice. It was a reminder that the fight for respect was a continuous journey, one that demanded not only forgiveness, but a bold stand against those who dared to belittle the inherent worth of another human being. As Eliza emerged from the laboratory, her face etched with the raw imprint of remorse and fear, the cabin's atmosphere was irrevocably altered. The passengers' silent support, the regulatory intervention, and the profound realization on Charles's face all converged to create a moment of catharsis, a moment that promised not only accountability, but also an epic comeback. In the ensuing hours, as the plane soared over the sprawling landscapes of America at 35,000 feet, each passenger bore witness to a subtle yet powerful spectacle, the rekindling of a resolve that would soon transform personal humiliation into an inspirational quest for justice, change, and yes, magnificent retribution that would leave onlookers utterly astonished. Charles Washington had spent his life flying under the banner of the airline his brilliant wife Zara Washington had built with every ounce of her determination and grit. On Flight 267, the air was thick with unspoken tension that stretched across every seat like an invisible rope. As the plane cruised steadily at 36,000 feet, Charles's phone vibrated again. It was another message from Zara. Her words were crisp and clear. She had already handled things on the ground. "She apologized yet?" He texted back with an almost imperceptible nod, knowing full well that her intervention was never just about him, but about every single person who had ever been made to feel like an outsider. Zara's message had reassured him. She would be waiting at the gate, and nothing would be left unresolved. With a calm that belied the storm within him, Charles slid his phone back into the inner pocket of his jacket. Every action on board took on new meaning after Zara's decisive order. Charles was not merely enduring another moment of quiet humiliation, he had become the silent symbol of dignity amid the palpable disgrace orchestrated by Eliza, the cold-hearted flight attendant whose bias had pierced the sanctity of first class. As Eliza busied herself with futile tasks, wiping already spotless tray tables, meticulously straightening napkins that never even crumpled, she avoided Charles's row like it was a minefield of judgment. Each time she passed by, her steps slowed, and though she never stopped entirely, the distance between her and Charles seemed to burn with the intensity of 1,000 resentments. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed into a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that forces passengers to clear their throats or pretend to scroll through their devices while their minds replayed the scene over and over. The whispers and furtive glances from fellow flyers carried an undercurrent of guilt. In seat 2A, Tariq leaned toward his neighbor and murmured, "Did you see how she strutted back from the cockpit? She really got called out for that disgraceful mistake." Tariq's hushed tone was met with a knowing nod from the man next to him, a silent admission that the incident was as inexcusable as it was public. Meanwhile, in the galley, Mina, always the gentle yet principled soul, moved with quiet determination. She balanced a glass of sparkling water, its effervescent fizz a small defiance against the stale air of prejudice, and carefully set it on Charles's table. "Sir, sparkling water, on the house," she said softly, a gesture that carried both respect and a tacit apology for the collective discomfort that had permeated the cabin. Charles offered a faint smile and a nod of gratitude, acknowledging Mina not just as a fellow crew member, but as an ally who recognized the injustice unfolding before everyone's eyes. As the flight continued, Charles's thoughts began to wander through a long list of humiliations he had suffered throughout his career, each one a painful reminder of how society had consistently tried to subtract from his worth. He recalled a hotel manager who had made him wait like an afterthought, a department head who had complimented his speech only to immediately add a patronizing remark about his background. These memories, though painful, no longer fueled raw anger but instead stirred in him a deep, simmering resolve to ensure that every slight was recorded by the conscience of those who witnessed it. Today, however, there were witnesses. Today, every pair of eyes in the cabin bore silent testimony to an event that would not be allowed to fade into the shadows of corporate bureaucracy. A live post on social media by a vigilant passenger named Fariha had already captured the scandal in stark detail, proclaiming to the online world how a man of authority was humiliated in first class, all because of an attendant's snap judgment. Back in the galley, Eliza's steps were laden with the weight of impending consequence. Mina's quiet yet cutting words had not escaped her, echoing in the confines of the cramped space behind the beverage cart. "You think I'm finished, don't you?" Eliza had snapped in a strained voice, her defiance trembling on the edge of remorse. Mina, leaning wearily against the coffee machine, had replied slowly, "I think you're lucky he didn't say more. Most people wouldn't have handled it like that." The exchange, brief yet piercing, had laid bare the raw truth. Eliza had allowed her own biases to dictate her actions, undermining not only her professional integrity, but the dignity of a man who had already endured a lifetime of disrespect. When asked if her behavior was rooted in racism, her silence spoke louder than any apology. Mina's gentle admonishment, "You should start thinking about what you're going to say when we land, because I don't think this will go away with a half apology," resonated as a stark warning of the reckoning that was fast approaching. In seat 2C, Charles continued to observe the unfolding drama with measured composure. His phone buzzed yet again, a terse instruction from Zara. "Plane lands in 20 minutes. Don't speak to anyone else. I'll handle it from here." A faint smile appeared on his lips as he realized the magnitude of Zara's determination. He had long known that his role was not just to endure, but to serve as a beacon of resilience. The silence that followed Zara's orders was different now. It was a silence thick with the promise of accountability, a silence that transformed each whispered conversation and every curious glance into a collective declaration that something profoundly unjust had taken place. Passengers, once absorbed in their personal reveries, now shifted in their seats with an almost palpable awareness as the plane began its slow, deliberate descent. As the announcement came over the intercom from Captain Nazer, informing everyone that the aircraft would be beginning its descent in about 45 minutes, and that security had been alerted to ensure Charles would be treated with respect upon landing, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The usual pre-landing chatter was conspicuously absent, replaced instead by a tense, expectant stillness. Charles sat quietly, his back straight and his hands neatly folded in his lap, not from nervousness, but from an almost serene confidence. He had weathered countless storms of prejudice throughout his distinguished career, and while the scars were undeniable, they had also forged in him an unwavering resolve. The humiliation inflicted by Eliza was not something he would simply let go. It would instead become the catalyst for a response that was destined to be as grand as it was just, a response that would reverberate far beyond the confines of a single flight. In the midst of this charged silence, Navid, a regular business traveler in a sharp suit, had hesitantly leaned forward, his voice measured as he approached Charles. "Sir, if you don't mind me saying, I saw what happened earlier. That was unfortunate," he remarked, struggling to hide his unease. Charles looked at him steadily and pressed gently. "Did you think it was a mistake when she questioned me, or only after you realized who I was?" The question hung in the air, its implication resonating with every passenger listening intently. Navid's eyes shifted, and his face flushed with the weight of his complicity in a system that routinely allowed such injustices to be overlooked. His faltering response only deepened the silent affirmation among everyone aboard that this was no ordinary mishap. It was a clear, unambiguous act of discrimination that demanded more than a meek apology. As the plane's descent continued, every detail of the incident was now etched into the collective memory of all on board. Fareha's social media post had begun to gather momentum, amplifying the story far beyond the confines of the aircraft. The direct message from ground control confirmed that upon landing, security and a formal escort would be waiting to ensure that Charles was treated with the respect he deserved. A stark contrast to the earlier humiliation. Meanwhile, Eliza's fate loomed large. She was to remain aboard after the passengers disembarked, escorted directly to the operations office, where she would face an executive review. Her silent, heavy steps and the desperate tension in her eyes told a story of impending accountability and a bitter lesson that would not be easily forgotten. The final moments before landing were marked by a peculiar blend of anticipation and somber reflection. Charles sat with quiet dignity, absorbing the gravity of every whispered conversation and every sidelong glance. His mind, though deep in memory, was now focused on the certainty that justice was not something that could be brushed aside in a boardroom meeting or hidden behind diplomatic apologies. Instead, it would be executed with a precision and grandness that left no doubt about the consequences of discrimination. Even as the seatbelt sign chimed softly and passengers buckled in, a renewed sense of purpose filled the cabin. The unfolding events had transformed a routine flight into a moment of profound transformation, a turning point where silent suffering was finally met with a resounding promise of retribution that would have every spectator exclaim in astonishment. Charles Washington was not just a man who had been humiliated. He was now the embodiment of resilience, a living reminder that dignity, when challenged, would always ignite the flames of a magnificent comeback that could not be ignored. Charles Washington understood that dignity never had to scream to be heard. It simply needed protection. And today, that protection was provided by his resolute wife, Zara Washington, whose presence commanded respect like the ceaseless hum of an engine at 35,000 feet. As he sat listening to the soft murmur of the airplane while the city lights began to shimmer beneath emerging clouds, his phone buzzed with yet another message from Zara. Her terse note read, "Security will meet the aircraft. Do not speak until I arrive. Watch their faces." A slight knowing smile tugged at his lips as he tucked his phone safely away, contemplating the impending reckoning that would soon descend upon them all, like the breaking of turbulent sky. While Charles waited in his seat, the clouds outside began to part, revealing the glowing city beneath. A metaphor, perhaps, for the truth being unmasked below. In the bustling galley, Eliza clutched the counter with clammy hands, her eyes darting between the aisle and Charles's row, unable to escape the reality of her misstep. What had started as a casual, thoughtless verification of a boarding pass had spiraled into a public humiliation of a decorated officer, executed not in error, but out of an insidious bias that had long poisoned her judgment. Eliza repeatedly reassured herself that she was just following routine, but every glance from the passengers confirmed that her selective scrutiny was neither procedural nor impartial. The silence in the cabin now carried a weight of disapproval as passengers exchanged whispered judgments and uneasy glances, each knowing deep in their hearts that her actions, rooted in prejudice, would soon demand accountability. In a quiet gesture of solidarity amid the growing tension, Mina, the young flight attendant known for her genuine kindness, moved beside Eliza without uttering a word. The unspoken exchange between them conveyed more than any reprimand could, a recognition that Eliza's behavior was not only unacceptable, but fundamentally wrong. As Mina methodically checked the landing preparation items, Eliza's voice trembled as she questioned, almost to herself, "Are they really coming?" Mina's silent nod confirmed what everyone already suspected. Zara Washington was already waiting at the gate, her reputation preceding her like the calm before a storm. Zara was a woman who had built her airline from the ground up, who had earned her place through grit and determination, and whose decisions were final. She had always been a leader whom others followed willingly, not through intimidation, but through the quiet authority of unwavering principles. The announcement from Captain Nasir had already signaled that their arrival in Chicago would not be ordinary. As local time flashed 6:42 p.m. over the intercom, he informed the passengers that security would assist with the deplaning process, a statement that immediately set minds racing and mouths whispering. Every passenger in first class felt the profound shift in the air, aware that the resolution of this incident would be swift and uncompromising. Charles watched all this with a calmness born of years navigating both professional accolades and personal indignities. He had endured many moments when his competence was questioned and his presence doubted simply because of who he was. Yet today, every pair of eyes on him reinforced that the quiet dignity he carried was not to be dismissed lightly. As the aircraft taxied to a private gate, the scene outside became starkly dramatic. A sleek black SUV waited silently, its tinted windows shielding its occupants as two security officers stood rigidly by the jet bridge. Near them, a woman in a tailored navy coat, her scarf fluttering slightly in the evening breeze, stood immovable, her resolute gaze fixed on the plane. That woman was Zara Washington, a leader whose very name evoked both respect and accountability. Inside the cabin, as the door slowly swung open, passengers shifted in their seats, some leaning forward in eager anticipation, others craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the woman who had come to deliver justice on behalf of her husband. Captain Nasir made his way from the cockpit to Charles's seat, instructing him in measured tones to remain seated until security had escorted him. Charles nodded, embodying the calm assurance of a man who knew that he was part of something far greater than his individual suffering. And then, with all eyes fixed on the entrance, Zara stepped on board. Her face was devoid of any pretense of a smile or a raised voice. Instead, her measured, deliberate gaze swept across the cabin, taking in every detail of the earlier injustice with quiet determination. When her eyes fell upon Charles, she offered a subtle nod, a silent confirmation that the wrong that had been done was understood and would be redressed. Her gaze then turned to Eliza, and in that moment, as if time itself paused to acknowledge the severity of the transgression, Eliza's composure crumbled. Every earlier attempt at defense dissolved into a pallid realization that her authority was no longer her own. Zara, with the calm authority of someone who has rebuilt empires, approached the cabin center stage. Once her presence had thoroughly saturated the space, she began to speak, her voice reaching all corners of the room without the need for amplification. "My name is Zara Washington, and I am the CEO of this airline," she announced with clear, measured cadence that immediately silenced any lingering murmurs. "A few hours ago, my husband, Police Chief Charles Washington, was publicly questioned not because there was an error in his ticket, but because someone decided, based solely on his appearance, that he did not belong in first class." Her words, unequivocal and stern, cut through the oppressive silence like a scalpel. "This airline adheres to strict rules and procedures, and nowhere in our training do we teach judgment based on appearance. We cannot and will not tolerate prejudice in any form." The air in the cabin grew even heavier as every word resonated with the truth of lived experiences. Zara turned her unyielding gaze toward Eliza, whose face had turned ghostly as she struggled to find a defense. "You embarrassed a man who has dedicated decades to protecting lives, including those who look just like you, and in doing so, you failed to follow procedure, failing to verify his boarding pass properly before subjecting him to public humiliation," Zara stated with unwavering clarity. Eliza, at first attempting to stammer a response, was quickly cut off by Zara's raised hand. A silent command ensuring no further excuses would sully the moment. The impact of Zara's words rippled through the cabin as passengers grappled with the reality of what they had witnessed. The tension was palpable, every eye a silent witness to the transformation of an incident of prejudice into a call for justice. 2 uniformed security officers entered the cabin without fanfare, moving purposefully toward Eliza. "You will come with us," one of them stated, his tone leaving no room for discussion. As Eliza was escorted off the plane, her face a mask of resigned humiliation, the passengers bore expressions that ranged from guilt-ridden sorrow to quiet satisfaction, each silently condemning the injustice that had occurred. After Eliza's removal, Zara turned her attention back to Charles, her demeanor softening ever so slightly as she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "They have scheduled a full review, and effective immediately, the crew member responsible will be suspended," she said quietly, her tone laced with both authority and empathy. Charles offered her a small, grateful smile. Standing together, they shared a moment of solace as Mina, the only crew member who had acted with the conviction of witnessing what was right, approached. Zara's eyes, now soft yet resolute, met Mina's as she said, "You may not have been in charge today, but you showed more leadership than anyone could have expected. I want to speak with you at headquarters when we return. I expect a full report detailing every observation from the beginning." Mina, taken aback by the rare praise from a woman of Zara's stature, bowed her head slightly in appreciation before nodding earnestly. The final moments in the cabin were charged with a sense of closure and the promise of accountability. As security escorted the remaining crew and passengers toward deplaning, Captain Nasir's gentle instructions reminded everyone that the experience they had shared would not soon be forgotten. Charles, now standing tall with his wife at his side, felt the burden of previous indignities lighten, replaced by the unyielding support of those who had borne witness to his struggle. The silence that had once surrounded him was transformed into an atmosphere of respectful acknowledgement, the kind that arises only when injustice is met with the unwavering force of truth and retribution. Stepping off the plane into the cool evening air of Chicago, the couple was met by a sleek black car waiting patiently at a private gate, its presence understated yet significant. The doors of the vehicle opened without fanfare, inviting them into a space where the forthcoming review would mark not only a punitive moment for those responsible, but also the beginning of a broader cultural reckoning. Zora's voice, firm yet gentle, echoed in her mind as she repeated her instructions to Mina. "When we return to headquarters, I need your full report. Every detail matters." Charles, now free from the confines of the airplane's oppressive atmosphere, glanced back down the aisle one final time, a silent farewell to a space that had witnessed his humiliation and the subsequent shattering of outdated prejudice. As they moved toward the waiting vehicle, the whispers that had filled the cabin transformed into expressions of newfound respect, a collective vow among the witnesses that such blatant discrimination would not be allowed to pass unnoticed. This flight, now etched indelibly in the memory of every passenger, was not simply about the retribution of one act of prejudice, but the firm declaration that dignity must always be safeguarded. Charles Washington, far from being defeated by a single moment of injustice, stood as a beacon of resilience, supported by a woman who commanded the skies and the hearts of those who believed in true fairness. And so, as the car door shut softly behind them, and the evening air enveloped them in a calm embrace, it was clear that the legacy of that flight would endure. A legacy of accountability, resilience, and an unyielding demand for justice that left no room for discrimination in any corner of the American skies. Charles Washington had endured his share of silent battles, but today the scales finally tipped in favor of justice. As he stepped into the waiting black SUV with his wife, Zara Washington, the memory of what had transpired aboard Flight 267 was as vivid as the city lights shimmering below. Zara had made it clear that dignity was not something that needed to shout to be heard. It simply demanded protection, and today that protection was hers to give. Charles's phone had buzzed repeatedly with Zara's curt instructions. Security would meet the aircraft and he was to remain silent until she arrived. A slight smile played on his lips as he slid his phone back into his coat pocket, understanding that what was coming was not a simple correction, but a monumental reckoning for everyone who had ever been made to feel they did not belong. As the plane's wheels touched down and the aircraft taxied toward a private gate, Zara's steady gaze had never wavered. Inside the cabin, Eliza, the flight attendant whose hasty, biased judgment had publicly humiliated Charles, remained behind. She was now sitting stiffly in one of the nearly empty back rows, being grilled by two senior operations managers. Zara had made her decision long before the plane landed. Although protocol required Eliza to remain on board until she was formally cleared for departure, Zara knew the outcome in advance. With quiet certainty, she climbed into the back seat beside Charles and closed the door behind her. The interior of the car was warm, its dim lighting a stark contrast to the harsh tension that had plagued the flight. In that quiet moment, Zara declared with measured authority that Eliza would never again don that uniform. Charles leaned back against the seat, finally exhaling a breath that had been held captive since takeoff. A long silence settled between them, a silence heavy with unsaid words and mutual understanding. In that silence, both knew that everything which needed to be expressed had already been conveyed through resolute looks and steadfast decisions. Zara's voice broke the stillness when she spoke, her tone equal parts resolute and sorrowful. She was confident enough to humiliate you in front of everyone and still believe she was right, she said softly. Charles, with quiet dignity, replied that she was not just confident but dangerously sure that no one would ever stand up to her misdeeds. Zara's eyes hardened as she responded, "That is something I simply cannot allow, not in my company and certainly not under my name." Zara wasted no time. She reached into her leather bag and pulled out a tablet. With swift taps, she opened a file labeled Immediate Action Crew Behavior Reform. "I am calling for a board meeting tomorrow," she declared, her voice rising just enough to be heard in the private space of the car. "There will be a full revision of our first-class service policy. I am mandating bias training for every in-flight staff member, setting up an anonymous reporting system for both passengers and crew, and beginning next week, I will personally hand-pick 5 crew leads to sit on a new internal review council." Charles raised his eyebrows in disbelief. "You are doing all this because of what happened today?" he asked quietly. Zara turned her head toward him, her eyes fierce with determination. "Not just because of today," she explained. "It is because the whole world saw what happened. In a world where people like you are humiliated quietly when no one is watching, today everyone watched and said nothing. That silence is the real enemy, and I will not allow it to continue." Charles's voice, steady yet laced with regret, broke the quiet again. "It isn't just about me, is it?" he murmured. Zara shook her head firmly. "It never has been about any one person," she said. "It is about every individual who has been made to feel less than they are. Today, when your rightful place was questioned in front of everyone, it became a symbol of everything that is wrong with how people treat one another." The SUV rolled slowly through the private exit gate as they left the airport behind. Back on board, Eliza sat alone amid the empty rows, her eyes red and her voice barely above a whisper, as she answered questions from 2 internal review managers. The weight of her actions had finally descended upon her. One of the managers closed the file in front of her and said, "We will be in touch within 24 hours. For now, your clearance is suspended. You are not permitted to wear your uniform or board any aircraft until further notice." No protest came from Eliza. In that heavy silence, she understood the cold truth. What had transpired was not a mistake but a choice that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Outside, the world continued to turn as Charles and Zara's car disappeared into the glowing cityscape. The cool evening air brushed against Charles's face, while inside the vehicle the leather seats offered a quiet but unwavering comfort. Charles's body relaxed, yet his mind was sharp, replaying every slight. The tone in which Eliza had asked, "Are you sure you are in the right seat?" and every look that dismissed him as unworthy of first class. Zara sat beside him, working steadily on her tablet with quick, decisive taps. "This isn't about reactionary anger," she explained quietly, eyes fixed on her screen. "This is about setting policy in motion. It is about ensuring that what happened today never happens again." When Charles asked if she was already drafting new policies, Zara replied, "Already done. Implementation begins Friday. Every crew member on every route will undergo rigorous retraining. No more surface-level training. No more empty apologies." She paused, her eyes softening ever so slightly. "I am not doing this just because you are my husband," she continued. "I am doing this because if something like this can happen to someone like you, someone with the experience, the calm, the dignity, it can happen to anyone who dares to fly first class, and not everyone has a powerful partner waiting to take action at the gate." The car soon pulled into the underground garage of their building, where security awaited. The vehicle came to a gentle stop. The door opened for them, and Charles was the first to step out, stretching his back as if shedding the weight of the day. Zara followed, still holding her tablet and her unwavering composure. They rode the elevator in near silence, the minimalist elegance of their apartment greeting them with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a quiet panorama of the city lights below. The steady hum of distant traffic and the blinking of far-off city lights reminded them that life would go on, that the storm that had passed on that flight was but a harbinger of the changes to come. Inside their calm and elegant apartment, Charles set his coat on the rack and made his way to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and took a measured sip while musing aloud. "I wonder if she will ever truly understand what she did today." Zara joined him, her tone thoughtful but resolute. "Perhaps not. That moment will haunt her, a reminder of how quickly power can crumble when challenged." Charles nodded slowly. "It is only a start," he murmured, "but a necessary start." The room fell silent for a moment, as both contemplated years of unspoken injustices. The unfounded assumptions, the look of disdain when they were treated as help rather than leaders. Their reflective silence was interrupted by Zara's phone buzzing with an alert. A media leak had surfaced. Someone online had posted about the flight, and now details were rapidly spreading. Screenshots, eyewitness accounts, and snippets of dialogue were making rounds on social media. Zara stared at the screen for a brief moment, then locked her phone firmly. "I do not need the world's outrage," she said softly. "My duty is to ensure that our policies are revised and that truth triumphs over prejudice." With that, she settled at her desk, opened her notes, and began finalizing her address to the executive board. Tomorrow's meeting would not focus solely on Eliza's misdeeds. It would be a clarion call for cultural change, a firm insistence on accountability, and a complete overhaul of the invisible rules that allowed discrimination to fester. Later that morning, under a pale, cold Chicago sky that made the city feel slow and introspective, Zara arrived early at the airline headquarters. Dressed in a crisp, charcoal gray coat and a smart blouse, her hair pulled back with immaculate precision, she entered the long glass boardroom where department heads, board members, and HR executives awaited. Silence fell immediately as every eye turned toward her. Without small talk, she placed a leather folder on the table and began her address with calm authority. "This is not a meeting. This is a correction," she stated. "What happened yesterday is not merely a personal insult to one man. It is the result of unchecked power and a failure in our training. We pride ourselves on excellence, dignity, and respect. But these words mean nothing if our staff use their authority to humiliate passengers based solely on appearance." Her words resonated through the room and not even a single interruption came. "I have launched a formal investigation. The crew member in question is suspended, but this is only the beginning. We will review every complaint from the past 18 months, every small incident that was brushed aside, and we will ensure that no one is made to feel they do not belong simply because of who they are." A senior board member, Irfan, cleared his throat as he questioned whether a public statement was necessary. Zara looked him in the eye and replied, "Our actions speak louder than words. Our commitment to change will be evident in every procedure we revise, in every mandatory training session we enforce." Her tone was firm, leaving no room for further debate. Back in the kitchen of their apartment, Charles gazed out at the city lights, still glowing steadily. Though his face betrayed no emotion, inside he felt a quiet peace, an emotion that had been so elusive over the years. The injustice he had endured had finally been seen and challenged, not by the clamor of angry voices, but by decisive action taken by someone who truly cared. As he and Zara prepared for the day ahead, the memory of that flight would remain with them as both a reminder of the battles fought and a promise that change, however quiet it might come, was inevitable. Charles Washington's ordeal on Flight 267 had reached a crescendo that would forever alter the course of an entire airline's culture. As the private black SUV glided away from the airport and into the softly lit corridors of the city, his wife, Zara Washington, remained at the door for a moment longer, her eyes fixed on the aircraft where Eliza was still inside. There, in an almost empty row near the rear, two senior operations managers sat interviewing the disgraced flight attendant. Eliza had been ordered to remain on board until she was formally cleared for departure, but Zara had already made her decision in her heart. The process would be carried out by the rules, but the outcome was as clear as day. Eliza would never again wear that uniform or wield her authority without accountability. Inside the SUV, the interior was warm and quietly lit, a striking counterpoint to the harsh tension that had filled the first-class cabin. Zara climbed into the back seat beside Charles and closed the door with deliberate finality. Her eyes never strayed from the horizon as she murmured softly, "She will never wear that uniform again." Charles leaned back and exhaled deeply, releasing a breath he had held since takeoff. They sat in silence for several long minutes, a silence laden with shared understanding and the weight of battles fought in silence for far too long. Neither needed to fill the space with words. Everything had already been said with looks and decisive actions. After a long pause, Zara broke the quiet. "You know," she began steadily, "when I took charge of this airline, I promised that every single person who boards one of our flights will be treated with respect and dignity. Today, I saw that promise shattered on that flight when a crew member decided, on the basis of nothing more than her misguided judgment, that you did not belong in first class." Charles offered a faint smile, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, as he recalled every painful moment of that day. From the cold question, "Are you sure you belong here?" to the painful silence of embarrassed stares from fellow passengers. In the private space of their car, Zara's fervor grew, and her voice took on a tone that was both authoritative and compassionate. "I have already begun the process of reform," she continued, tapping briskly on her tablet. "I am calling for a board meeting tomorrow to review and fully revise our first-class service policy. Effective immediately, every crew leader will undergo retraining, not by outside consultants, but by people who truly understand what it means to be watched, doubted, and judged. We are also establishing a protocol that enables any staff member, regardless of rank, to send a silent alert directly to my office if they witness discrimination, and starting today, any flight attendant with more than 3 flagged incidents will be subject to immediate review. We cannot let patterns of bias continue unchecked." Charles listened intently as Zara outlined her ambitious plans. "You changed so much when you took over," he said quietly. "I have seen that the power you have is not meant to humiliate but to protect, not just me, but every passenger who has ever felt unwelcome." Zara fixed her gaze on him. "That is exactly why I cannot allow this behavior to persist. It is not just about you, it is about every person who has been made to feel small, to be questioned simply on the basis of their appearance. We have let unchecked prejudice fester for far too long." The SUV rolled through the private exit gate, leaving the airport and its painful memories far behind. Back aboard the aircraft, Eliza sat isolated among the somber faces of the internal review board. Her eyes were red, her voice was barely audible, and every attempt she made to justify her actions fell flat against the overwhelming tide of evidence and authority. One of the senior managers closed the file in front of her and spoke with measured finality. "We will be in touch within 24 hours. For now, your clearance is suspended. You are not to wear your uniform or board any aircraft until further notice." In that single statement, Eliza understood that her future in this industry was now marked by her own choices made in a moment of thoughtlessness that would have consequences lasting a lifetime. Across the city, as evening settled softly over Chicago, Charles delivered a speech at a classroom filled with young recruits at the police academy. Scheduled weeks in advance, his lecture was about leadership under pressure and the importance of staying calm when your worth is questioned. His words, measured and profound, captured the attention of every cadet. In that room, Charles was not merely a police chief, but a living testament to the idea that dignity did not need to shout in order to be heard. It simply had to stand firm and unyielding, even in the face of relentless prejudice. By late afternoon, word of the incident had started to circulate within the airline's internal networks. Every crew member, from senior flight leaders to gate agents, had received an urgent message mandating mandatory policy review sessions. The tone of the message was direct and unapologetic, a signal that this was not an isolated incident to be brushed under the rug with a simple apology. It was a watershed moment, a declaration that the company was now committed to addressing and eradicating the subtle yet dangerous forms of discrimination that had long been tolerated. In small briefing rooms at training centers, staff whispered among themselves. Some justified Eliza's actions by insisting she was merely following protocol, while others remained silent, burdened by their own complicity in a system that had repeatedly allowed such injustices to occur. In one of those rooms, Mina sat alone, scrolling through messages on her phone. Colleagues she had not spoken to in ages reached out with words of reassurance and veiled congratulations. One message read, "Respect for how you handled it. You might even be promoted after this." But none of the messages offered comfort. Each one was tinged with the knowledge that Mina had been brave enough to look away from inaction when she witnessed Charles being questioned like an interloper. Soon, Zara Washington herself entered a small briefing room at the training center. With measured steps and a calm determination, she closed the door softly behind her. Mina rose quickly as Zara commanded gently, "Sit down." After a moment of nervous silence, Mina complied. Zara pulled out a chair and sat directly across from her. "I read your statement," Zara said firmly, "and I read it twice. You were honest, and more than that, you acted immediately. You did not wait for someone to give you permission. You recognized something wrong and did not hide behind the chain of command." Mina's throat tightened, and after a long, careful pause, she managed to whisper, "Thank you." Zara's eyes softened just a little as she continued, "I am reassigning you. You will be promoted to Flight Operations Lead Assistant. For the next 3 months, I want you to shadow my office and help oversee the new crew reform program. I need someone who truly understands what right looks like and what wrong feels like when no one else is willing to name it." Mina sat speechless, her heart pounding with a mixture of pride and relief. Finally, she managed to say, "Yes." With a gentle nod, Zara added, "You helped my husband today. You reminded this company who we are supposed to be." Meanwhile, across the city, Charles walked through the parking lot of the police academy after his inspiring speech. As he made his way to his car, his phone buzzed with a message from Zara. The words were short and transformative. "She is officially let go. Your name is now on the founding board of the Flight Crew Review Council." A smile crept onto Charles's face as he tucked his phone away. For once, silence had not shielded the powerful. For once, the quiet man had the final word. Evening fell over Chicago like a gentle curtain, drawing the day to a close while sealing the promise of permanent change. Back at home, In their high-rise apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the twinkling cityscape, Charles sat on the edge of the couch with a book forgotten in his lap. His eyes were fixed on the skyline, where the lights of the city shone like fragments of countless untold stories. Zara entered quietly from her office, a tablet in one hand and her signature calm determination in her eyes. For a few moments, they simply watched the city below, the silence between them speaking volumes of the battles fought and the changes set in motion. Charles broke the silence softly. "You did not come to bed last night." Zara smiled faintly and replied, "Neither did you." Then, with a reflective tone, Charles continued, "I wonder if she will ever really understand what she did that day." Zara moved closer and sat beside him, saying, "Maybe not today, but she will remember exactly how it felt when she was escorted off that plane and when the world finally held her accountable. That memory will stay with her forever." Charles nodded, recognizing that while this was only the beginning, it was a start, a vital step in a journey toward systemic change. As the night deepened, a news article appeared on Charles's phone. The headline read, "Airline CEO takes swift action after in-flight incident. Employee dismissed and new reform program announced." Beneath it were photos of Zara speaking confidently in a boardroom and Mina standing proudly by her side. Charles knew that the quiet power of dignity and accountability had triumphed over the silence of prejudice. For the first time, every person who had ever felt unseen or disrespected on a flight knew that change was real and that no one would ever again be asked, "Are you sure you belong here?" In that moment, as Charles and Zara sat together, enveloped by the soft glow of the city lights filtering through their window, they shared a quiet understanding. They had not only defended their dignity, but had sparked a movement that would transform the very culture of their airline. And that transformation, fueled by the courage of a quiet man and the decisive action of a formidable leader, would ensure that the era of silent injustice was finally over.